Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and being here. Thanks, Mona. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us online this evening. It's good to have you here. I'm really excited to have Chris White come be here tonight. I'll say a few words about Chris in a moment, but I need to make my pitch for the National Catholic Reporter. First, as I said last year, it's not loud enough? That's better? Okay, so Chris, right here. As I begin a pitch about the NCR, I have to tell you that I'm a subscriber, and I faithfully read it. I read Chris's column and Michael Sean Winter's columns faithfully, and I always look forward to the Homily Helps by Sister Mary McGlone. So if you read her stuff, you might hear echoes of it in my homilies occasionally. I said earlier that without a doubt, the NCR is one of the most important Catholic journalistic voices in the country right now. I was saying a moment ago, too, that in the 90s, it broke the story of the clergy sex abuse. 11 years ago, when the women's religious communities were being investigated by the Vatican, they were the first to step up and speak out on their behalf. A great journalistic integrity of the NCR. I said too that they gore everybody's ox. The progressives and the traditionalists alike, and so I think that's a sign of good that the NCR has done its job. Chris is I don't know, we met several years ago after he became the Vatican correspondent. He's very well liked. He's extremely well respected as a journalist, including among his colleagues. A sense of that I've had the last couple of days is that Chris has the phone numbers, the cell numbers of I don't know how many cardinals. And that just gives you a sense of how much people trust Chris in his profession there. He gives us a unique perspective because of his position with the NCR in the Vatican, and his writing is passionate, it's clear and fair, and gives us always a human touch, human perspective on the various stories that he's reporting on. He told me today or last night that every time he meets with the Pope, when he goes on these papal tours, when he speaks to the Pope directly, the Pope has come to expect Chris to tell a story or tell the Pope what some American prelates are saying about the Pope, which always makes they're unfavorable ones, and it always makes Pope Francis laugh. So. Anyway, please welcome our friend, Chris White. You want to say what the format will be?
Sure. Thank you, Greg. And it's wonderful to be back here at St. Ignatius. I've affectionately taken to calling this place my West Coast parish, and so I'm just delighted. And you all have a lot to be proud of here. It's the last time I was here, there weren't even pews. This is a real gem, both for the city and for the church. And so I'm just honored to be back here. I'm going to speak for a few minutes, probably 15, 20 minutes. But the idea is to provide sort of a table setting so that we can have a conversation and leave plenty of room for questions. And so I go ahead and start thinking of ways you want to put me in the hot seat. I was in New York for a few days before I came out to California, and some of my non-Catholic friends said, "I can't believe you're going out to California, of all places, to give a talk about the Vatican and all things religious." And, California is supposed to be secular and pagan. And it reminded me of a joke that's pretty popular in Rome. And it says that the Holy Trinity had won a prize. And the prize is that they could go anywhere in the world. And so they're sitting around talking to each other, and God the Father says, I think I want to go to Africa. There's so much suffering there, and that's where I'm going to go. And the Son says, I'm going to go to Palestine. And the Holy Spirit says, I'm going to go to Rome. And they asked, well, Rome? Why Rome? And he says, well, I've never been there. And despite some people thinking that might be the case, what I want to do in my remarks this evening is just to kind of give some reflections on where Pope Francis thinks the Holy Spirit is leading the Catholic Church in the 21st century. And this Pope has made it very clear that he believes that the whole church is called to undergo a deep conversion, and he sees synodality as the main vehicle for reform, and to really implement some of the changes that were sort of first brought about by the Second Vatican Council, but for many, many reasons have either been delayed or never fully realized. And the talk that I've been asked to give this evening is titled, "The Future of the Synod, Where Do We Go From Here?" But I thought it might be helpful before we talk about the future just to kind of give everyone a sense of how we got here, to give you a quick history lesson, because I know not everyone is reading NCR every day, and I don't fault you for that, although you definitely should be doing that. But this synod, when we talk about that, I'm referring to this multi-years long process. So synods began in their current form at the end of the Second Vatican Council. And Pope Francis really recognized synods as a way of inviting the whole church to participate more broadly in the broader reforms in the life of the church. So there have been 5 synods under Pope Francis, but unlike past synods, which were bishops and just a handful of priests and theologians gathering in Rome for a month to talk about an important topic, Pope Francis wanted all of the people of God to participate in this particular synod. So it's often been called the Synod on Synodality, which is a really jargony phrase that we'll try to unpack a bit. But this three-phase process began in 2021 with listening sessions that took place all across the globe. Tens of thousands of listening sessions with tens of millions of Catholics really being invited to voice their concerns, their hopes, their fears, their aspirations for the Catholic Church. Then they had continental assemblies to talk about sort of what ideas were bubbling up at a continental level. So there were 7 continental meetings. And then in 2023 and in 2024, both Octobers, the Synod came to Rome for 2 major month-long meetings. And I think it's fair to suggest that this process from the outside, especially if you're a Catholic, this might not seem, very revolutionary in a world in which anyone can just kind of go online and offer your own opinions about any idea under the sun. But in the Catholic Church, where most of the time ideas are often short-circuited and carefully watched, for all Catholics to be invited to have a conversation about issues that for a very long time have been considered taboo in church life, this was pretty revolutionary. And in fact, some observers have described the Synod as the largest consultation exercise in human history. So during these years since 2021, I think it's fair to say that the faithful in the pews have had a lot to say. They've made it very clear that they wanted the church to expand ministries for women, to become more welcoming of LGBTQ people, to have a deeper reckoning with the clergy abuse history and the crisis that's followed that, for church leaders to commit to greater transparency, to become less hierarchical, less clericalist, and more willing to listen to all of its members. And at last October's session of the Synod, there were there were 400 delegates that gathered in Rome to discuss these findings that had surfaced from all over the world. And there was no major consensus that was reached on some of the most neuralgic issues, but a lot of ideas began to bubble up. And the members there, these 400 members, of which for the very first time included women that had a right to vote at the Synod, they recognized, quote, an urgent need for women's leadership. There were deep divides over whether this could include a restoration of the female diaconate. And in the end, the final working document left some of these questions very open. The final report didn't use the acronym LGBTQ, which had been used throughout the Synod, because there had been some conservative pushback. But the document in October 2023 acknowledged that on questions of sexuality and identity, the Church's, quote, anthropological categories are currently insufficient and need to be better informed by scientific developments. In 2023, other proposals that surfaced included job performance evaluations for Catholic bishops, the possibility of women preaching, and much more. The idea in October 2023 was to sort of put everything on the table. And then the delegates went home to their respective corners around the world. And I think it became increasingly clear to Pope Francis that battle lines were being drawn ahead of the October 2024 summit. Some traditionalists warned that Francis was on the cusp of overturning long-standing church teaching, while progressives thought that the Pope might punt on the chance to make some long-lasting reforms. Then this past March, things got even murkier because Pope Francis announced the formation of 10 study groups that would consider some of the Synod's most divisive issues. The idea was to take some of the issues off of the topic of conversation and focus more on the practice of synodality itself, but we'll get back to that. I was going to have slides this evening, but that was kind of a technological challenge. So we have some printouts for you, some photos that are postcards of the Synod. So if you look at the first photo that you have there, it's not anything that happened in Rome, but rather something that happened in Belgium. And for those of you who follow Vatican news, you'll know that in September of this year, Pope Francis took this wildly ambitious trip to Asia and Oceania. It was the longest trip of his papacy, and that was the trip that got a lot of attention this year. But just on the eve of the Synod, there was a much smaller trip, and I want to start there for our reflections this evening. It was a 3-night trip to the tiny countries of Luxembourg and Belgium, and the main purpose of that trip was to celebrate the 600th anniversary of the historic Belgian University of Leuven. Even before the Second Vatican Council, Leuven was known for its commitment to educating lay theologians, and today it still boasts one of the leading faculties of theology in the world. And on that particular Saturday in late September during the Pope's visit, we sat there, we reporters and the faculty of Leuven sat there in this beautiful 15th century building where the rector of Leuven and the Pope held a dialogue about what it means to be a Catholic university. And as someone who has the great privilege of traveling with Pope Francis around the globe, I can tell you this was not unlike most papal events. They weren't there just to exchange niceties. It was a very serious conversation. The rector gave an impassioned speech where he drew on his own love for J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Frodo's, for those of you that are familiar with the novel, Frodo's great adventure leads on many paths. Some of them don't always make sense. Some of them are dangerous. But all of them are ultimately in search of truth. And this rector that evening said that the same is true for Catholic education. He said that there's a need to respect tradition, but also to be open to innovation. And what I would describe as a remarkably bold address, seated right next to Francis, the rector pleaded for the Catholic Church to reconsider its stance against the ordination of women, to become more welcoming to LGBTQ people, and to have a more serious reckoning as to how the clergy sexual abuse crisis emerged in the first place. This is what he said, quote, "Why do we tolerate this considerable gap between men and women in a church that is so often carried on the shoulders of women? Would the church not be a warmer community if there was not a more prominent place for women, including in the priesthood?" It wasn't all criticism. He praised Pope Francis for his own efforts to make the church more hospitable to the LGBTQ community. But he said, would not the church, quote, not gain more moral authority in our corner of the world were it to have a less forced approach to the topic of gender diversity? Too often, he said, the church only provides, quote, once and for all universal answers. And then he added some wisdom from Tolkien that, quote, not all who wonder are lost. In another era, not so long ago, I think it's fair to say that sort of candid and frank challenge to the Pope would be silenced by Vatican officials. And here in 2024, they're taking place side by side with the Pope himself. And I want to start there by sharing that story because I think it's important to keep in mind when assessing what it means to be a synodal church, where the goal is to make the church more welcoming, more participatory, and better capable of listening to all of the voices of all of its members. Now let's travel from Belgium to Rome, where at the start of this synod, just like last year, Pope Francis asked Dominican Father Timothy Radcliffe to lead a 2-day retreat for all the synod delegates, and you can see Father Radcliffe in the photos that you have in front of you. And then in the middle of the synod, he actually announced that he was going to be making Father Radcliffe a cardinal in December. Those retreats are available online in full, and I encourage you to listen to them. They're great spiritual nourishment. But during one of Father Radcliffe's talks, he offered an image that I think is a real interpretive key for the whole synodal project. He encouraged the delegates to think of a fishing net. And he said that a fishing net is held together by ropes that create strong bonds. But a fishing net has plenty of open spaces to allow the water to freely flow through it. And he said this is what the synod process is reckoning with. A church where in places like the United States or Germany, many Catholics believe that the church is behind the times, particularly when it comes to how it ministers to marginalized people. In Africa, however, as we saw from the fallout that resulted from the Pope's decree last year allowing priests to bless those in same-sex unions, their realities look quite different on the ground. The Synod, Radcliffe said, must ask what are the necessary bonds of communion to keep the church together, and where might there be open spaces for pastoral creativity and freedom? Practices and disciplines can and should, he said, look very different in places like South Sudan than they do in places like San Francisco. So as the Synod started, with the mandate from the Pope not just to focus on particular issues, but to rather deepen their understanding of the practices of synodality, and what concretely must happen for the church to be synodal, the synod delegates returned to Rome, and they once again met around round tables, as you can see in the images in front of you. The round tables, to quote one cardinal, became the icon of the synod, capturing what it was supposed to be all about, with celibate cardinals seated next to lay women and lay men, and all having an equal voice and an equal vote. And throughout the month of this synod, this past October, I spoke to scores of delegates from all over the world, and what they attested to, almost to a person, was that this atmosphere, this new atmosphere of roundtables, had created a space over the past 2 years where synod delegates had a real environment of trust and respect, where they could share different life experiences and differing opinions. It was what the British theologian and synod advisor Anna Rowlands characterized as a church that is healthy on the inside, but outwardly facing. And a lot more like that scene played out in Leuven, of a church more defined by dialogue rather than being just simply a doctrinal watchdog. It was certainly a different environment, I'd suggest, than the next photo on your slide, of another famous scene that took place during the same month where other power brokers sat around a table and talked about the future. That photo, the next photo, is of the Al Smith dinner in New York. As you can see, then candidate Trump speaking to Catholic leaders in New York. Despite the conditions of trust that emerged, it wasn't all smooth sailing. And I think that's a very good thing for a synodal church. As I've mentioned a few times, during the first session of the Synod, some of the hot button issues were delegated to special study groups, including one very famous study group called Study Group Number 5 that dealt with the question of women's ministries. And ever since these study groups were announced in March of this year, Study Group Number 5 has sort of been shrouded in mystery. This study group was supposed to address women's ministries, but particularly the question of women being ordained to the diaconate. Unlike the other study groups, Study Group 5 did not reveal its membership, did not reveal how it would be operating. And despite the fact that last October's Synod described women's ministry to be, quote, an urgent issue, there was no transparency or accountability on how they would operate. On the opening day of the Synod this year, Cardinal Fernandez, the head of the Vatican's doctrinal office, who oversees Study Group 5, gave an update saying that the Pope did not consider the question of women deacons to be mature, but he didn't provide any further clarification on how the group might be moving forward. And already the Synod delegates in Rome were pretty miffed, and they asked for a special session to be added to the Synod calendar so that they could get some answers from Cardinal Fernandez on what was taking place inside his study group on this very particular question. So a date was added to the calendar, and so Synod delegates were quite happy that they were going to have a chance to engage in dialogue with Cardinal Fernandez. But except when they showed up for this meeting, Cardinal Fernandez was not present. He had sent 2 junior staffers from the Vatican's doctrinal office who did not even serve on the study group. And they informed the room that they weren't there to answer any questions about how the group operated, but instead they said those present could simply line up in single file and take a slip of paper that included an email address in which they could submit their own feedback about the issue of women in the church. Now, it wasn't quite like Jesus overturning the tables in the temple, but what ensued was pure outrage from the theologians, the cardinals, and the lay delegates that were there in Rome that day. And it wasn't because everyone in the room was on the same page and sought the same outcome on this particular question, but there was unanimity that Cardinal Fernandez and his study group were simply not operating in a synodal manner. A church that is synodal, they insisted, means that bishops can't just make unilateral decisions, even if they are bishops or indeed cardinals that run major Vatican departments. At a press conference right after that incident, Sister Natalie Becar, who you can see in one of the photos there, she's the number 2 official at the Vatican Synod office, admitted that, quote, even the Roman Curia is learning how to practice synodality. And that's a pretty rare acknowledgement from a Vatican official to admit that there's a learning curve and that learning curve is steep. Many delegates would point to this moment and this meeting as a turning point in the Synod, a time where church leaders at the highest level were held accountable for their failings. As the Synod approached its end, it was unclear to me as a reporter, though, how the Pope was going to be able to land the plane. After 3 years of initiating this process that it had invited all the people of God millions and millions of Catholics to share their voice, I was honestly thinking that I might be writing an obituary for the Synod when it finally reached its conclusion. I suspected that the final document that would be produced would probably be vague and lacking specific recommendations. But instead, I was pleasantly surprised that when the Synod delegates met on October 26 to vote on their final text, it contained a surprising number of targeted, concrete changes. Among them, overhauling the training for future priests, demanding greater lay involvement in the selection of Catholic bishops, the expansion of women's ministries, including keeping the door open for the female diaconate, and a revision of church law to mandate greater transparency and accountability throughout the church. And this is quite an accomplishment for an Italian system that doesn't even have words or language that includes language like accountability or conflict of interest in the language. Now, the Synod stopped short of proposing certain dramatic changes, such as the full restoration of the diaconate or greater recognition of LGBTQ Catholics that many reform groups had sought. But importantly, it didn't close the doors on those issues either. The Synod's final document notes that access to the women's diaconate remains open and calls for a church that, quote, does not exclude people because of their marital situation, identity, or sexuality. Most interestingly, however, at the conclusion of the final assembly, Pope Francis announced that he would not be writing his own final document on the Synod, which is something that normally happens after a Synod, where the Pope takes the recommendations and provides his own thoughts some 6 months or a year later. Instead, he accepted the proposals of the Synod and asked for its immediate publication, saying that the people of God had spoken. This was the first time in his papacy that he had taken such a dramatic step, and it was a decision that means, as a part of his own magisterium, are these very recommendations that the Synod produce. And for those invested in the Synod process, I would suggest that's very good news. It's a document that demands for a significant presence of women in seminary formation, for priests and bishops and ministers to receive regular job evaluations, and all of that, in its 51 pages it's chock full of recommendations, is now considered a part of the ordinary magisterium of Pope Francis. The challenge, however, would be implementation. In the corporate world, I think it would fail any sort of smell test. This sort of document would require an action plan with specific measurables and a roadmap of how the Catholic Church is supposed to get there. But it's fair to say that the Catholic Church here has a lot of catching up to do. The day after the Synod ended, I spoke with Cardinals McElroy and Cupich, who are some of Pope Francis's top advisors in the United States. And I asked them what this might mean for the U.S. Church. They suggested that there needed to be a permanent restructuring of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, including a full-time committee on synodality that would begin to hold the U.S. Church accountable on the implementation of the documents, of the proposals in the final Synod document. As we talk here tonight, the U.S. bishops are currently meeting in Baltimore, and I know they are discussing this, so we'll have to wait and see what comes of their meeting in the next few days. But I think it's fair to say whatever happens, it will only be a start. As we know, much of the U.S. hierarchy remains at great odds with Pope Francis and the broader direction of his papacy. So the acceptance in this country in particular will be uneven at best. What it does do, however, is establish synodality as the new norm of operating. To use the language of the Synod's final document, which again is magisterial, synodality is, quote, a constitutive dimension of the Church. Quote, in simple and concise terms, synodality is a path of spiritual renewal and structural reform that enables the Church to be more participatory and missionary so that it can walk with every man and woman radiating the light of Christ. The challenge, I think, that many of us in this room will recognize is that after an event like the Second Vatican Council, there were immediate changes in the life of the Church. Catholics in the pews could tell something had shifted just for the fact that Mass was being celebrated in the vernacular and the priest faced the congregation. Synodality, I think, is much, much more difficult and takes much more time. Cardinal Hollerich, who is one of the Pope's top advisors and one of the Synod's main organizers, was very blunt the day the Synod concluded, saying that Catholics won't see a change immediately. He said, "Change takes time, but if the path of synodality is followed, Catholics will see a church where they count, where they are important." Now, I've included a few photos in the slide booklet of some of the Synod's youngest delegates. There are folks like Wyatt Olivius and Julia Oseca from the United States, and Jose, they are the two youngest members of the Synod, who are both from the United States. And also folks like Jose Uriquidi from Mexico, who brought his own daughter to one of the Synod sections so that the Pope could wish her a happy birthday. These, I think, are important faces to remember. I think many of you in this room have either heard about or seen this major new film that's just out called Conclave, focusing on the election of a pope. In fact, Father Greg and I got to see it this afternoon. I was one of these delinquent Vatican reporters that had not seen it yet, so we were able to check that off. But if you're familiar with the film and its storyline, I promise I won't give you any spoilers here. In it, the cardinals are portrayed as power-hungry, driven by their own ambition, and there's no shortage of backroom wheeling and dealing. I think it's fair to say that the Synod on Synodality at its best is an effort to change that image of the church. And in fact, restructure the church so that individuals like Julia, Wyatt, and Jose and their voices have just as much say in their own church. A synodal church is a church where there is space for dialogue and disagreement, even when it comes to big ideas, because to quote the rector of Leuven, "Not all who wander are lost." And in a synodal church, there's plenty of room for honest searching. But where that path will lead and how we get there is the big question in the years ahead. So I say that to just start our conversation, and now we can be much more synodal and have a conversation together. So, Greg?
Thank you, Chris. News to me was that the document from the Synod is part of Pope Francis's magisterial teaching. That's quite extraordinary. So the floor is yours. I'll run around with the microphone. So just raise your hands. Anything that Chris has spoken about, perhaps questions about Pope Francis and Chris's experience of him, personal experiences of him, whatever questions you might have.
So thank you, Chris, for a wonderful talk. Could you tell us how they pick the lay people that take part in the Synod, and will the same people be taking part again and again?
Yeah. So the question about how Synod delegates were picked is a bit tricky, but I'll try to give you the simplest explanation possible. So when Pope Francis opened up this Synod for laity, every bishops' conference was asked to submit 20 names of people who had already been heavily involved in the Synod process in their respective country. And from that, they submitted 20 names to Rome, and each continental bishops' conference, a total of 10 were chosen. So there was a sense in which these were people that were handpicked by the bishops' conference, but I think I know most of them, they weren't people just simply there to carry the company line. They were real independent voices that did not hesitate to use their own voice and speak in their own name. And they were both the people at October 2023 and October 24. They were there at both sessions. And the Synod now moves into the implementation phase. And so that stage is now over. So their own role is effectively to just be involved at a local level in its implementation. But the ages range from Wyatt, who was 19 in October 2023, to people in their early 90s. So you really had a broad swath of participants. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. By all accounts, the next administration is going to have policies verging on the cruel toward immigrants. Given that the incoming vice president is a Catholic who has said that he was drawn, he's only been a Catholic for I think 3 years, by the social doctrine of the church. Have you heard either in Rome or among your contacts among U.S. bishops of the idea of appealing to the administration through future Vice President Vance to ameliorate the cruelty, frankly?
Yeah. Well, I think just knowing how the system works, I would suspect them to operate mostly on the principle of subsidiarity, starting with his local bishop in Ohio, and the Bishop of Washington D.C., the Archbishop of Washington D.C. But you're right, the fact that he is a Catholic enables in theory, a special line of communication and dialogue. We certainly saw that with President Biden. Archbishop Gallagher, who was the Vatican's foreign minister, was very blunt in an interview soon after Biden took office, saying, we have more in common with this administration than we did the previous administration. So I think they will try to appeal to his own Catholicism, for sure, but I don't know that we've been given any evidence of that over the past few months, that is exactly going to be what's motivating many of his policy decisions. I am sure that, both President Trump and Vice President-elect Vance will come to Rome at a certain point, and they will get an audience with the Pope and the Vatican's foreign policy service, as any president would. But how dialogical the next administration is open to being, I'm not sure. So. And of course, one of the big things that they will have to do is appoint their own Vatican ambassador. And that's a big question at the moment as to who they will pick. Their ambassador, President Trump's ambassador during the first term, was Callista Gingrich. It would not surprise me if she makes a return. She and her husband are quite fond of Rome and are there very often. And so I can tell you that during the very first Christmas Eve Mass I attended in 2021, the Gingriches had returned back to Rome, even though their time of service had ended. And former Speaker of the House Gingrich was passing out his latest book during the Mass to members of the Vatican Diplomatic Corps. So I think they're keen to be back in Rome if they can.
Thank you, Chris. I had one question, but your answer to an earlier question stimulated a second question.
Sure.
And so the second question is, we talked about the U.S. Conference of Bishops, and you talked about continental conferences of bishops. So if you could distinguish between
sure,
those.
yes.
And then the original question I had was, is there any accountability or process of accountability amongst the either continental or national bishops' conferences to make this thing work?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, as I said, the Synod operated in 3 phases. So the first phase was diocesan listening sessions, and then the second phase was a process known as sort of continental assemblies. And in Latin America, there's been a long, robust tradition through CELAM, which is all the bishops throughout Latin America, getting together regularly and speaking together as a united body. That has not been something that historically we've had in this country, where the bishops of Canada and Mexico sort of caucuses, if you will, to use that sort of language, with the bishops of Latin America. So the North American Continental Assembly is effectively the bishops of the United States and Canada. And then you have the bishops of Asia, the bishops of Africa, the bishops of Europe, the bishops of Oceania, and the bishops in the Middle East. And that is something that the Synod process has kind of given new energy to, with the idea that they should be meeting together more regularly. In terms of church law, there's no actual sort of defined language as to sort of how this is supposed to operate. But in the final document of this Synod, there's a real nod to more of this type activity to encourage greater collaboration and participation. But this is, I'd say, it's sort of in its nascent stages as to what this might look like. As for the question of accountability, that's the real challenge, is accountability and how you make all of this happen. There are proposals that emerge during the Synod that perhaps the Vatican Synod office might take on a more sort of, I don't want to say it's supervisory role, but something to that effect, where they hold bishops and countries accountable for implementing what synodality is supposed to look like. But again, these are all sort of what I would kind of call the sandbox stage, where ideas are sort of being workshopped and tested out. And what that looks like in reality is, I think, very murky, which speaks to the real challenge of this. There are great, profound ideas that surface throughout this process, but the implementation is going to look very uneven, because at the end of the day, that it involves not just simply a plan on paper, but a conversion of hearts and minds. And that takes a long time, especially in a Catholic Church that is used to operating in centuries. So.
Thank you. I have a question about the study groups. What is the future of the study groups, and particularly study group 5?
That's a great question. So these 10 study groups that the Pope established to provide greater in-depth study of some of the most divisive and contentious topics that emerged during the Synod, they've been given a mandate to carry out their work until June of 2025. So the study groups are their own Project 2025. So we'll find out what happens to them. So they're due to report back then, and the Pope is going to be expected to make some sort of decisions on what they present to him. But it is separate of the Synod itself now.
I sort of have a challenge for all of us. And I'm asking myself the question, what can I do to promote accountability in the church and discussion of important topics and so on? And I'm wondering if you have reflections about that.
That's the hard question. I often like to say, as a reporter, it's not my job to solve the problems, just to chronicle them. It's much easier to chronicle than to solve them. I think, for starters, I would say, I've been very fortunate throughout the past 3 years of traveling with Pope Francis in every single continent. And so I've gotten different glimpses of what synodality looks like in different places. But I would say where synodality is really thriving, there's almost always a parish as the starting point. And so, as I've said, before, I think this is a parish where synodality is very much already in action, where the idea of co-responsibility between clergy and those who are non-ordained, that is respected and already lived out here, but I think it has to start at a local level. And you see it throughout the 54 or 52 pages of the Synod final document, that the proposals always began at a local level. So parish, then your own diocese, then a bishop's conference, then a continental level, and then Rome. So I think, it's a very simplistic answer, but your own backyard has to be the place. There was one of the, I mentioned the round tables, and one of the facilitators of the round table said that she asked a very simple question to one of the round tables, which was, again, a mix of lay people, bishops, and priests. She asked them, how many elderly parishioners do you have in your parish that show up every Sunday and you don't know their names? Synodality starts by learning their names. And again, that might sound simplistic, but it was to sort of provide a practical takeaway, which is until you get it right at a very local level, don't expect the changes up top to take place. So. Yeah, exactly. So it's a challenge for the whole parish. So.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone. I'm visiting from Michigan, but I saw you were speaking tonight, and so I was
Thanks for
excited.
joining.
Oh, I was excited.
You win the award for furthest travel.
Yeah. So to your point about synodality and where it starts, we're a part of a parish in Ann Arbor, and our parish council has had a lot of discussion about the process of the synodal questions that we've discussed as a council being more important than sometimes the immediate outcomes. So it's the actual time to discuss it with one another and kind of, like the woman before me said, actually getting to know the people in our parish better. But there is inherent in that all of these factions that we experience, I'll just say even in our own parish and then as a diocese. And so I was wondering if that's been discussed in the Synod in terms of the unique structure of the U.S., even when you talk about how people were nominated. So you have a bishop who may lean a certain way, and then you have constituents who might be very different. Can you just talk a little bit about that and the awareness?
Well, I think there is an inherent tension within synodality because synodality requires and encourages every single person to have a seat at the table and to be involved in the decision-making process. But there still has to be a decision taker at the end of the day. And in sort of Catholic theology, of course, that's the Pope. So it's both a reminder of the desire for the church to be more synodal. But one of the things that the Synod itself was trying to reckon with was, what does it mean to be synodal in a church that is hierarchical and with a Pope who is effectively a supreme monarch? And that's a felt reality, I think. And at a more local level, you experience that between, say, a parish and then, being in a place where you might have, as you suggest, a bishop that is either enthusiastic about synodality or perhaps quite skeptical or even antagonistic of synodality. And that certainly surfaced in Rome as well. I mean, if you look at the 50-plus page final document, the Synod delegates voted on that paragraph by paragraph by paragraph. And the vote totals are online, so you can look at this on your own time if you like. But you can see, there wasn't unanimous support for, I don't think a single paragraph got full unanimous support. Even the final paragraph, which was, I think, just sort of a Marian reflection. So it's kind of a head scratcher there. But talking to the delegates at these tables, what I think most of them would say is the factions that exist everywhere in the church and in the country, they don't just simply go away, but synodality provides perhaps a methodology and a mindset and a program in which we can have these conversations in a more constructive way. So that one example that I wrote about this past month in the Synod was during one of the early sessions of this Synod, there was an African bishop who, during his time speaking to the entire Synod, gave a pretty impassioned address about the need for the church in Africa to provide greater pastoral care and welcome to those who are in polygamous unions. And then the next day, someone got up and gave almost an identical version of that speech, but instead of using the word polygamy, he used the acronym LGBTQ. And this is someone who did that because he recognized that the LGBTQ issues are deeply, make the African bishops deeply uncomfortable, in the same way that the issue of polygamy makes a lot of Westerners very uncomfortable. And he said afterwards, basically the bishop came up to him and said, and that was a helpful way for me to think about the issue. And I think synodality, that's one example, begins to provide openings to see things from a different perspective. So. And again, to use the example of soon-to-be Cardinal Radcliffe, it provides a chance to reflect on what are the strong bonds that are needed to hold the church together, and where is there room for the water and the fishing net to flow through so that there's, freedom of movement, greater flexibility, particularly at a pastoral level.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Did anybody talk about, can I say, dwindling attendance at churches in the United States and maybe Europe?
What was
Just
that?
dwindling attendance. Is anybody talking about smaller attendance, less attendance at church?
Sure. Just
through the
mass
US?
attendance and declining mass rates and stuff.
Yeah. And second, did Francis release a fourth encyclical? I heard it described as a kind of capstone to the Synod. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
Sure.
Thank
So to answer your first question, I think in some respects the whole project of synodality is driven by this reality that Pope Francis understands very well, that the Catholic Church, particularly in much of the Western world, is experiencing a crisis of identity, and particularly you see declining rates of mass attendance, shortage of priests, and this reckoning with, how do you sustain this, and what does it mean to be church in the 21st century and beyond? So I think that's at the heart of this whole project of synodality, and I think what the Pope would say is, for the church to be credible in the modern world, it has to have a greater emphasis on mission and ministry that is much more inclusive, much more concerned with the communion of all of its participants. And so I think that's why he's trying to lead the whole church in what I would say is this sort of soul-searching exercise. And so even if it's not talked about directly and you're not looking at the statistics, that's certainly kind of baked into the whole project, is this big question of, how does this affect the people in the pews and getting people in the pews? As for the encyclical, so I think what you're getting at is the final week of the Synod, Pope Francis released the fourth encyclical of his papacy, which is on the Sacred Heart. So it's not directly related to the Synod, but the Pope has had a long-standing devotion to the Sacred Heart. It's a very long document that if I was someone advising the Vatican on communications, I would have said it was terrible timing because it kind of got lost because of the fact that all eyes were focused on the Synod, and then the Pope releases this document. But I would say most people are just now getting a chance to take a look at it because it's about 150 pages. But I'd say it's a passion project of Pope Francis, because he's had a long-standing, devotion to the Sacred Heart, and this is something that he's been working on for quite some time. But it's not directly connected to the Synod.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you had any pointers for someone looking to understand more about the sort of like theological and historical precedents for this vision of synodality.
Yes, I think depending on how much reading you want to do, I think some of the best and most accessible writing about synodality, both theologically and historically, has been done by an Australian priest, Orm Rush. He's got a very accessible 150-page book that I forget the title of, but if you Orm Rush, ORMRUSH, and if you just Google that, I think that's the best starting point. It's certainly been helpful for me. But I think, the documents themselves that the Synod produced, at every stage there were documents that came out. And so I think they are very helpful in kind of situating this whole process in today's church, particularly the document Enlarge the Space of Your Tent, which was sort of the first big document that started this all off, and it gives you some of the history as well. And then I guess I'd say finally, just many of the documents of the Second Vatican Council are necessary kind of background reading to kind of get up to speed as to how we reached this point. And I'm happy to give you my email address and can email you the names of any of these.
Okay, it's 8 o'clock, so we'll just take a couple of more questions here.
This is a pretty basic question. I think I'm sort of embarrassed to ask it, but in light of all the emphasis on retraining bishops, holding accountable people in positions of power, and yet contrasting that to the apparent lack of acceptance of rights for women and so forth in the church, are you optimistic that the Synod will have any effect on really bringing that forward? It's sort of like a fox in the hen house, that
Fair.
the bishops are supposed to hold the bishops accountable. I don't get it. Could you enlighten us on that, Chris?
Sure.
Your talk, by the way, was fabulous. Thank you.
No, it's not a basic question at all. It gets to the heart of so much of what's at stake. I'll give you a story. I'll share with you a story that captures why I think there's reason for optimism. But I don't want to be Pollyannish. I think it is a real challenge, particularly in a place like the United States, where the bishops themselves are so divided over Pope Francis. So it's very tough to build up momentum towards something like synodality when their own house is so at odds with each other. But some of you here may have heard me talk about this story because I've written about it. But at the end of last October's synod, so this was October of 2023, I was interviewing one of the lay delegates from Switzerland. Her name is Helena Jeppensen, and she's worked in the Catholic Church in Switzerland for 20, 30 years. And so I was just asking her about her experience. And she said, look, what we're getting done here in Rome is progress. It's not where I'd want us to be, but let me tell you a bit about my own experience. And what she recounted to me was that in 2019, this was on the eve of the Synod on the Amazon, so a synod that the Pope had called to address all the needs of the particular 9 nations of the Amazon region. And she said, at that particular synod, the religious brothers had been given a right to vote, but the religious sisters had not been given a right to vote. And it was a really offensive move from, in fact, the Pope himself, because it was very clear that the right to vote had nothing to do with one's ordination status, because the religious brothers aren't ordained, but simply because of the fact that they were men. And she said, I gathered here in Rome with women from all across Europe and the United States, and we protested outside of the Vatican Synod office. And she said, we held up signs, saying, votes for Catholic women. And she said, and that was me in 2019, standing outside of the Vatican Synod office. And less than 5 years later, I'm inside the Vatican Synod Hall with an equal vote and an equal voice. And she said, for me, I have to take that as reason for hope. And for me, that's enough motivation for pushing ahead. So I share with you that story because I think it captures, a pretty sober sense that it's not for her, perfect, but she sees this as a different era where change is possible.
So, Chris, the Pope Francis has Pope Francis has now appointed a pretty overwhelming majority of the College of Cardinals. How has that been reflected further down in terms of bishops' appointments, and how does that impact, our U.S. conference?
Sure. So as of next month, Pope Francis will have named exactly 80% of the men who will elect his successor. And so, more than 2/3 of the cardinals who one day go inside the Sistine Chapel to vote on the next pope will have been appointed by Francis. So one might think that that's a guarantee lock for him, in a sense that, his successor will be someone that is in the same mold as him. And I think there's many good reasons to think that. But that being said, Pope Francis has named a number of people, not for their own sort of ideological, stances, but he believes them just to be pastors. And he's also wanted to diversify the College of Cardinals. So, for example, Los Angeles does not have a cardinal now. Milan does not have a cardinal now. Paris does not have a cardinal now. But there's a cardinal in South Sudan, and there's a cardinal in Papua New Guinea. So that's one way in which he's tried to invite greater representation of the College of Cardinals. I would say Pope Francis has not focused as much on bishops' appointments, particularly in this country, as the past two popes. Pope John Paul II was very adamant that if he just got the right archbishops in place, they would be his foot soldiers, and they would help identify the next cohort to be bishops, and it was kind of like a feeding system. Pope Francis has not operated that way, and I think most observers, certainly my colleague Michael Sean Winters, who's always worth reading and gets to say more on the opinion side than I get to as a reporter, would say that the Pope should spend more time focusing on bishops' appointments, because while there's an effort to make the church less focused and dependent on just its hierarchy, it's still a system that relies heavily on bishops, and so you want to get your right team in place, your right government in place, and that's something that he hasn't done. That being said, Pope Francis has a tremendous opportunity in the next 2 years to radically reshape the U.S. hierarchy. I think it's more than a dozen, perhaps closer to 24 archbishop seats are coming up for retirement. And so there's a real window in which, should he choose to, he could, in a very short period of time, change the face and the balance of the U.S. hierarchy. But he hasn't really made the sort of legacy appointments that John Paul II in particular was very interested in doing.
Okay, last question. Thank you for your talk, by the way, and some of the responses here also as well. Very engaging. Synodality was like from from very early on for me was one that was very hard for me to get excited about. It's almost so hard to describe. It was against it. Like you could even go back and say, John the 23rd, when he was talking about the updating of the church and getting the church closer to our culture, open to culture. What was it, adjournment or whatever, I can't remember the Latin word used for that. It was easier to focus on. It caused a lot of problems in Vatican II and all that whole thing, right? And I often felt that Pope Francis's idea of the field hospital, which he wanted to listen to the people that were out on the edges and let that filter back in and change us, was an easier thing to latch onto than this synodality thing, right? Which is, and I think we've all kind of witnessed that over time. But there's one thing that's always kind of been a hook for me, and that was our Christianity is a countercultural thing, right? If you take the gospel, and I'll pick three things. One is, let's say, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the story about the rich young man getting turned away, and even the story of the prodigal son, right? All three. They're deeply countercultural, right? They're meant to, make us be a challenge to those around us in every which way, as much as we can. The point I'm getting to here, or the question I'm getting to is, there's two reactions to that. One of them is where people, we respond along the lines of either the Franciscans that are out there and saying, hey, you know what, we have to live poverty in our lives, right? Or the Jesuits here, our Jesuits, who say, go aside and examine your life, spend time in silence and be countercultural like that. Or all our efforts to be a good neighbor in all that means. And that's one response, right? There's another response out there, and it comes in this kind of, and it's amazing how attractive it's become to younger people, which surprises me deeply, is where the response is about reverence and like being more Catholic than Christian. Like, when they want to go receive communion and they want to kneel down, and it's almost this identity, and it's part of this whole, pluralism that's kind of being subverted to kind of create a division of what my identity is. And my worry is, right, that when Pope Francis is not getting any younger, and I have this big worry that as soon as he's gone out of there, that this whole synodality thing and all the good stuff that's involved in that is just going to get swept aside. And your comment about that you were writing the obituary for synodality, and I mean, I could see that happening, and the next guy taking over and saying, I want to fight rather about whether we call it a chalice or a cup, will take over. And I don't know if you see some of that in what you're dealing with. And how would you respond to that challenge, if you would, for all of us, to be able to kind of repoint everybody, and that includes those of us that are on that, the so-called, the other side of those divides. And it's amazing me that so many young people are attracted by this, I think, overt reverence. I don't, maybe I'm not making sense to a lot of people here, but it seems like it's easier, and we see this in our bishops as well. Some of the bishops are more concerned about, high liturgy, and it's almost like an offshoot. I'd be interested in hearing what your response to that is, because I see it as something that's very immediate.
Yeah, that's a lot to consider. I think, it's fair to say that because you acknowledged that Pope Francis, he turns 88 next month, December 13th. And, you know, he's in remarkably good shape, all things considered. But it's also true that he's had a number of health challenges in recent years. And so this is, you know, for some people, he's playing a game of trying to beat the clock. The Synod will be his legacy. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the next conclave will be a referendum on the Synod. And to what extent this is the direction of travel for the global church. And it is an ill-defined term. I've written that synodality reminds me of Justice Potter Stewart and his obscenity test, that you know it when you see it, but it's just very hard to define. I think the Pope is simply making a bet, and has made this bet that the Church will learn by doing, and that doing is in motion. And that's the big question, as to will it catch on? And I'm not going to look into my crystal ball. I would just say that, you know, there have been some surprising results. I think it was the bishop of somewhere in Denmark gave this interview at the end of last year's synod saying, I was a real skeptic, but now I'm a complete convert. I've been at a number of conferences over the past few years where other voices were echoed to that, you know, something to that extent. But we will see, and it's something that I think has to catch on both at the ground level and at the top, and it's a big question mark. I don't have much more to offer you except to say that this is something that remains to be seen.
Just to briefly conclude before I thank Chris, one of the things, a term you used early on in your, I don't know if it was in your talk or in answering the questions, but you talked about co-responsibility between those of us who are ordained in the church and those who are not. And that's a word that I've used for all of my time here at St. Ignatius, because I really believe that we hold the mission of our parish together, that no one of us is ultimately, well, I suppose in one way I'm ultimately responsible, but we're all responsible for stewarding what God is both giving us, has given us, and listening to where God is calling us. We have this model here, this leadership model of 4 commissions, which are made up of parishioners, one for community life, one for liturgy, one for faith formation, and one for mercy and justice ministries. And your fellow parishioners do that ordinary business of the church, of our parish. And then from each of those 4 commissions, there are 2 people that make up the parish council. Commissions are meeting quarterly and on a Sunday, and then 4 days later, the parish council gets together, brings what their experience from those Sunday meetings. A year ago, we changed the format of those meetings. In the first hour of those Sunday afternoons, is we offer people an experience of Ignatian spirituality, and what's become clear to me this year in doing this is that I think our project in that part of our meetings on those Sundays, and then again at the parish council meetings, is helping people develop their ability that already exists, but help people to develop their ability to notice God in their own lives and in their work and in our parish itself. I think that's a precursor in some way to this notion of synodality, because if we're talking about a relationship with the Lord and able to talk about it with one another and listening to how God is moving in our own hearts and how we believe God is moving in our parish, we're going to be, we're going to understand one another better, but we're also going to have a deeper sense of where God is calling us as a faith community. So that I just want to throw that out there in terms of how one of the ways that we as St. Ignatius Parish are trying to respond to this notion of synodality and deepening this ability to notice God in our own lives and in our parish and to talk about God. So that just gives you an small insight into one of the things that we're doing here at St. Ignatius. Chris, thank you very, very much. Yes, go ahead. Thank you. We're here because we love the church, and I think you give us plenty of reason to be hopeful about the church. So thank you for your time with us here at St. Ignatius. God bless you in your work, your ministry on behalf.